So basically, in this presentation, I was discussing the relationship between digital humanities and archival research in the context of feminist media history. By sharing the methodology and results of the pilot project Broadcasting UK Feminist video, mapping local histories and transnational networks of the 1980s in the BFI Archive. So the project, funded by FIAT IFTA Media Studies Grant, investigates the collaboration between UK broadcasters, Channel 4 and ITV, so independent broadcasters, and feminist film and video makers in the 1980s in the context of the United Nations Decade of Women. So my focus was 1975, 1985, but then obviously a little bit stretched over. And by combining archival research, textual analysis, so close reading of the programs and the broadcasts, and data visualization tools, the study analyzes a selection of 23 broadcasts from the BFI archives, mostly documentaries or current event shows made by feminist and women producers or thematizing the topic of gender equality between 1982 and 1987. So here, just to give you like a flavor of what kind of like people were pictured in this programs, but also a little bit this 80s feeling of this broadcast as well. So these programs mostly focused on questions of global development and the role of gender in structural inequalities around the world, and had a particular focus on the women of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In this respect, they are representative of the encounter between the transnational agenda set up from the UN Decade of Women and the objectives of national broadcasters. In particular, here I'm talking about Channel 4, which was established in 1982 and was committed to provide the UK with a cutting-edge offer in the areas of producing and circulating educational content, including about these topics, but also support local independent audiovisual productions. So some of these productions were actually produced by the workshops. This is also a good period for the workshop movement, and in collaborations with independent television. And also, Channel 4 has, in this period, in this initial period, also a goal to enhance gender equality within its own structures, but also promoting, again, a greater inclusion of women producers and practitioners. So this is very synthesized in a way. But looking a little bit of the liminal archival status of this broadcast that I have analyzed, I was very intrigued by the fact that they also had some sort of like non-theatrical distribution. So they also circulated beyond broadcasting as sort of like films in itself, as within activist circuit or independent filmmaker circuits at the time. And I found it interesting that, again, their copies are within the BFI National Television Archive because of their broadcasting mostly. And they have been basically preserved as off-air recordings. And this is very interesting also in terms of the preservation, because obviously there's no original tapes or negatives, and there's no material around their production history. And so this is also a kind of like interesting way to see a different way of accessing women's productions, which is usually accessing the films in itself. It's more difficult than finding some traces in archival documents instead. But what I found very useful for me was also working with catalogs, so both analog ones and obviously working within the digital, the BFI catalog, online catalog in itself. So I complemented the work on the British National Film and Video Catalog, and also I worked on the Catalogue of Circles, which was an independent feminist distribution company based in the UK. And also I looked at catalogs from NGOs and other organizations that actually circulated the films, because in that format they circulated as films, even though, again, in the UK they were mostly consumed as in television. So what I found also very interesting is finding like this sort of like continuity or discontinuities between the cataloging online, and this like analog and archival resources. And obviously, there's a continuity in terms of like how this data and information around these programs is scattered, and also, again, the metadata and the cataloging on the BFI online catalog in itself, it's very fragmented. So I decided to use this study and try to use digital humanities precisely to confront with some of this fragmentation and lack of access to sources other than, again, the recordings mostly. Well, I found that digital humanities could provide me a dynamic model to move across different scales. The micro scale of the production and also their kind of circulation, but also the way they also circulated at the meso and macro level. But also identify patterns of representation and kind of link them together, harmonizing the close reading of the program, of the broadcast in itself with the study of the context, but also look at like how I could like address issues of visibility. So I have really had to dig within the BFI National Television Archive to find these sources. And so I wanted to see if using digital humanities could kind of help me to challenge or to kind of overturn certain patterns of archival invisibility or visibility. And then I wanted also to test the limits of the national as an attribute of the BFI collections, because again, as I said at the beginning, most of these programs were aimed to illustrate the condition of women outside of the UK, and particularly with an outlook to Africa, Latin America, and Asia. So what does it mean, who this heritage belongs to, right? And I thought, again, the digital humanities could really help me to kind of address all these kind of different points, especially because one of the methods that I really wanted to use was data visualization tools. So this idea of like collecting data from the resources, from the catalog, and making them visible in these data visualizations. So in my use of digital tools, I was inspired by the idea that archives are not just sites where serendipitous encounters with women's histories and audiovisual productions could take place, but they're also places where new knowledge can be generated beyond the mere recuperation of individual histories. In doing this, I was inspired by Deb Verhoeven, who worked and addressed the question, the relationship between digital humanities and feminist archival research, emphasizing on the epistemological power of focusing on the connection, links, and relations within and both digital and analog physical archives. So other than using digital methods to see these connections, Verhoeven suggests to look at the continuity between the digital infrastructures that we put in place to study the archive with the historical and material conditions that have shaped the preservation of those materials. So with this in mind, I designed a research process as follows. So I made a selection of case studies representative of different modes of production in feminist and UK broadcasting in the 1980s. So again, independent, but also workshop, but also commissions that were made by Channel 4 itself, and within the period that I was interested in, the UN Decade of Women. Then I made some data collection, both from close reading of the primary sources, but also tried to find whatever I could about the production and circulation history. And then I did all this kind of like a small database to run through a online software called Palladio that enables you to produce data visualizations. And then I made a thematic analysis of these data visualizations, which consisted mostly in maps and network analysis. This is the not very exciting database and data set that I produced. It doesn't look great. It's just an Excel spreadsheet. But this is just to signal you how easy it's kind of to compile your data set, and then really you can just upload it in this digital tool, which kind of enables you to observe and address and find links across the data. And I was interested in tracing back every aspect of production, but also casting crew. And in the close reading of the broadcast, I look at the people that were featured, but also the locations and the events that were featured. Again, most of these were current events or documentaries, sort of like programs. So it was obviously they were related to something that was happening, current events again. But I wanted also to see, since also the topic and also the what I was working on, I really wanted also to kind of see how this data visualization and data collections themselves could be approached from a feminist perspective, because data collections is basically, or data sets, are archives itself. They are produced in a way. So I was producing my own archive by collecting this data. And so I looked at the idea of looking at this idea of omissions and fragments within the archives themselves, and looking also how data sets and data collections can often perpetuate the invisibilization of the feminized labor of preservation that is behind a lot of archives in itself. But also in the field of data science, more specifically, it has been noted that data collection itself as a practice can be very much an invisibilization and categorization process that can, again, perpetuate inequalities. And so this is a way in which I also wanted to look critically at the data visualizations that I was producing myself, and kind of to address the homogenizing problems that comes with using categories when we look at very complex and nuanced archival objects, like, again, broadcasts of this kind. So just because it's a question of time, obviously, I have to be kind of quick at this point. I just wanted to show you one of the results of this data visualizations, and just look to you what it might be the risks, again, of homogenizing and flattening the data that you can collect. And I wanted to just show you two maps that I produced, again, and which show the locations that are featured in the sample of programs that I've studied, of the broadcasts that I've studied. And you see that there are different clusters of, again, locations that are represented here. And there's, again, as I obviously already pointed out, a concentration of clusters in Africa, in Asia, a certain part of Asia, and then Latin America again, but also Northern Europe, partially because of the productions from where this broadcast came from. So there's a huge concentration of the UK. But these are the clusters that instead suggest the countries of production, so which production companies were involved in producing these broadcasts and from where they come from. And there's a dramatic difference, right? And it's obviously maybe commonsensical considering the archival location of these resources. But at the same time, signal also a dramatic difference of who's, and also gives you very much a strong sense of who represents and who's represented and who owns, in a way, the gaze, if we want to use this expression. But as, again, even these maps are approximations, and we can only just have some kind of glimpse around it, but really gives you an idea of how data visualizations can really help you to link and connect patterns across sort of like bigger groups of resources. So just to conclude, just a few considerations. So what I wanted to convey is that basically a critical feminist use of digital tools problematizes the omissions within the archives and supports the discussions on the limitations inherent in the process of data collection and categorization. In this case, for instance, we look at these two maps and they kind of like signal uneven patterns in a way. But also there are other approximations of, this is especially when I was doing the close reading, and also in categorizing nationality of practitioners, which was another thing that I was looking at, that obviously, again, reminds us of how we have to simplify to make data and to produce it. And so there's always like some stuff that remains invisible. And just to go back to the maps that I've showed you, there's also this idea of whose heritage again. So I guess this is also the countries represented also signals that those countries that were represented in these fields might be interested in kind of like understanding how this broadcast might be part of their own heritage in as well. And then finally, there's potential also to harmonize the study of representation and production history in archival research to, again, using data visualization tools or digital humanities. because as I said, all my data was both a result of close reading and data collection from archival resources on production history. And just I wrap up now. Thank you, Dalila. Yeah, I mean, I obviously agree, and would be also a very, very welcomed collaboration from my side. And also in terms of self-archive, there's, again, producing a data set and doing this, it's also a way of self-archiving as well, and produced an archiving as well, because data sets in a way are new forms of archiving. But yeah, absolutely, it would be great to have that kind of collaboration in place. And also, obviously, there's also a need for an institutional link, because there's so much that, again, researchers as individuals can do to kind of enable the preservation of private collections. I mean, I guess one of the questions that kind of like raise the research questions that then emerge from having to approach this archive, which again is interesting because it was immediate access to the actual primary source, so the program in itself, the recording, right? And there was no complementary materials, which my hypothesis is each individual filmmaker or practitioner own in their own home, right? And maybe they don't have a copy of their own broadcast instead. So it would be interesting, again, for BFI owns, I'm looking at Lisa here, who owns the recordings, to kind of like being kind of like a link also to these like practitioners who own this precious material. Because again, we know that, for instance, Channel 4 don't have it, I guess. There's no archive for it. So, but again, the BFI doesn't owe any production record or anything, because again, this was all recorded off air. So possibly, yeah, crowdfunding, but I wonder again how existing archival institutions can also liaise and kind of create. But again, it's not my place here, but I think it's very interesting and also complex to put in dialogue these private collections with these national archives that have been built around the completely different scopes.